to the Hall of Fame podcast. I'm your host, John Franklin. I'm joined today by the man who is the reason there is even a reason to create the Hall of Fame. He changed sports, he changed martial arts, he changed lives. He is the creator and co-founder of the Ultimate Fighting Championship and newly minted UFC Hall of Famer. He's the great Art Davie. Art, how are you?
Great today. We're just enjoying the opportunity to kind of recuperate from this weekend, and we're going to be going over to 226 tonight at the T-Mobile Arena.
So your story with the UFC is well documented. So for our interview, I want to go in a little bit of a different direction, mainly because if folks want to learn about the beginning of the UFC, I would encourage them to first buy your book, watch the documentary on Fight Pass, or listen to your Hall of Fame speech. All much better representations of that story than we can do here. What I want to know is how the seed was planted before it was hatched. So let's start from the beginning. Who were your parents?
My parents were Madeline and Johnny Davie. My father was an insurance agent, insurance broker. My mother was a housewife. I was raised in Brooklyn, and it was a middle-class family. The church was important. I went to Catholic school for the first 9 years. Ended up at New York Military Academy, where my roommate from 1962 through 1963 was Donald J. Trump. So I had an early, typical middle-class upbringing in a big Eastern city. And I always tell people that the seminal experience for me was June 22nd, 1965. I was training at a boxing gym, thinking about going into the Golden Gloves, and I got into a brawl with a wrestler. Started out as a simple argument, and before you know it, it morphed into a fight. And it taught me that I didn't know anything about fighting, and I probably ought to learn something about this grappling business.
So I was waiting for it to come up, so we can't pass over it without talking about it. So it's 1962, it's 1963. You look over at your roommate. Did you say, guy's going to be president of the United States someday? Or what did you see in Donald Trump at that age?
Well, it was very interesting. Donald had been at the school for a couple of years. He actually entered, I believe, in 8th grade. I came in as a junior, and we spent 2 years. I only spent 2 years at the school. Trump was 16. I was 15. What I'll tell you about Don Trump was he was the BMOC right on campus at that time. He was the big man on campus. Everybody knew that there was something special about Don. He took himself very seriously. I remember in particular how impressed he was with the publicity that Richard Burton and Liz Taylor had gotten on the movie Cleopatra. They were the first super media stars. They were the Kardashians of the 60s. And I remember Don always saying to me, if you really understand how to talk to the press, well, you can really make a big thing in this world. I think that Don Trump, even then, was running for office. I think he had an ability to influence people. I think he had an ability to lead. The big story that year was he was supposed to be a lieutenant in Battery E, where we were. He had been at the school since the 8th grade, and they only made him a supply sergeant. By the way, I was a private. The next year, he did make captain. He was and I remember there was a lot of talk about maybe they had passed him over for lieutenant there as a junior. So Don was a guy, I think, where you have to realize always wanted to succeed, and he didn't take failure lightly. What I do also remember was when we had the military inspection from the U.S. government, Don was upset that I had a conversation with the colonel that sounded like maybe I was just talking to a kid on the block. He kind of chewed me out afterwards. He said, that wasn't very military. I never forgot that.
That's interesting. So yeah, even then, the seeds in both of you were planted of sort of the showman, the publicity, and what role, if any, getting back to your parents, what role, if any, did they play in your relationship with fighting? Were they encouraged for you to be a boxer? Did your dad like it? Did your mom dislike it? Or vice versa?
In terms of my parents and how they related to the whole combat sports universe, in my family, there were two things that were true for the men in the family. My father and 3 of my uncles had served in the Army honorably in World War II, came out with some medals, and everybody in my family at some point boxed. My dad had boxed as an amateur as a kid in the 1930s. My Uncle Jack, same thing. So I grew up around that world. The idea that Carmen Basilio, Jake LaMotta, Rocky Graziano, Rocky Marciano. Those were the patron saints in my universe. On the other hand, my mother always referred to it as roughneck sports. And the irony was when I started the UFC, after it was going for about a year or two, she kept saying to me, she called me Arthur, never Art or Artie. She said, Arthur, are you still involved in that roughneck sport?
So everybody has their guy that really hooked them into combat sports. Mine was Don Fry, so thank you very much for that. Who was your guy?
In all fairness, I'd have to say that for combat sports, the seminal experience for me was reading about Rorion Gracie in the 1989 September issue of Playboy magazine. The article was called Bad, and I tell the story, and I talked about it in my Hall of Fame speech. I needed a way in. I needed to find a martial artist, a rebel, a maverick, and there it was. Rorion Gracie's family had done mixed-style fights, both in Brazil and in the United States. The Gracie Challenge wasn't successful on a money standard, but on the other hand, he was the guy that I learned how to roll with. I had never grappled, and as I said, I had been training for the Golden Gloves when I was a kid, did a little boxing in the Marines. So for me to learn how to grapple and eventually getting my blue belt from Rorion Gracie was the way in for me into the universe that eventually led to the modern world of MMA.
So that kind of answers my second question. Your relationship with fighting in between the time when you stopped boxing and when you created the UFC, was it always kind of like if there were fights on, you were watching them, still with that mindset towards there may be something more for this, or did you kind of get away from it for a while, or was it always kind of there? It was like, I always use the term like, you know that feeling when maybe the oven's on at home and you can't, it's in the back of your head, you can't get on, you think you turned it off, but was it always kind of there?
Well, you know, after I had lost to a wrestler, I got very interested in the subject of mixed-style fights. And actually, as you know, it was a big topic when I was in the Marines. When I was in the Marines, every grunt had an opinion about boxing versus wrestling versus martial arts. You know, could Bruce Lee have beaten Muhammad Ali? Somehow this thing had never completely left me. And you know, by the time that I was an advertising executive, a salesman, an account executive, an agency, at one point my boss turned to me and said, "Can you come up with some great new ideas to present to Wisdom Imports?" They were importing a number of beer brands into the United States. And again, this idea had never left me. It's 1965 about boxing versus wrestling, grappling versus striking. And I proposed an idea to them, which I was calling at the time World's Best Fighter. Later on became War of the Worlds. That idea had never left me. And by the time that I had done some research and had found out about the Gene LeBell versus Milo Savage bout, Salt Lake City, 1963, or eventually Antonio Inoki and Muhammad Ali in Japan, Tokyo, 1976, I was already prepared to understand that this business about mixed-style fights, nobody had ever figured a way to cook it up, make it work, package it. And I got to tell you, never left me. And by 1989, I really had the brainstorm about what I would do. I would answer the question, what's the best fighting style? And I would stage a live sports pay-per-view, an 8-man, one-night tournament where fighters from every discipline would be able to compete on equal terms. Change the world.
It surely did. And this is the time in which I want to kind of explain to you my thoughts on your contribution. Not that you don't fully understand it, but I think that what you did was in showcasing the martial arts, you showed their deficiencies and changed martial arts. You made a martial art that was not previously, you said, okay, there can be some success here, but each of these is limited in a way that together they are not. And then that spawned the newest thing, whereas everybody was sort of trying to figure out how to show their martial art to be the best. They realized that we all have deficiencies, and that's what evolved us to where we are now. This is going to sound like a crazy question, but you're probably one of the only men in the world who can answer it. What's it like to have a passion for something that doesn't even exist, something you're certain is going to change the world, but it's a vision that most can't even understand, or it's pretty difficult to articulate?
You know, I got to tell you, in the beginning, I was the only one who believed in this idea. In a way, I was alone. And, you know, for 3 years, I was a guy possessed. I just knew, though, there was the opportunity of a lifetime, and that if I could do this, I would change the world. I had a clear vision of it. People once said to me in an interview, they said, you know, Art, did you ever feel that you maybe had a crystal ball? And in a way I did, because I saw that this was going to become very big. I realized with my research that pankration for over 1,000 years had been the biggest sport in the ancient Greek Olympics. So in a way, all I was doing was bringing back the fighting of the ancient world. It was primal MMA. It was grappling, punching, kicking, throwing, holds and chokes with no biting or eye gouging. I was bringing back something that for 1,041 years was the dominant combat sport in history. So I think my feeling is that I know this is going to work. all I got to do is what I'm very good at, and that's persuade people. Be the Pied Piper, play the tune, and the children would follow me. And I guess that's what happened.
You know, and that segues perfectly into my next question. Your good friend Sean Wheelock said in his induction speech for you that the history of mixed rules fights is that each side lobbies, or to paraphrase him a little bit, negotiates for rules that benefit their side. So how did you convince these guys to fight where there would be no advantages other than the perception of their own skill set being the best?
Everybody was touting their particular martial art. Taekwondo was this, Judo was that. We felt that this opportunity for a real mixed style encounter, a true kumite, would expose the liabilities, the problems with each. Now, the good question is, how did you get guys from Taekwondo, Judo, and whatever to do this? And I got to tell you something, I had a very easy way of doing it. My pitch was always the same. You know something, bro? Nobody really knows how good you are, do they? What about if I could give you the opportunity to show what you are to the world? Would you really be willing to do it? Do you have the guts to do it? Are you willing to put your reputation on the line? And hey, if you can, you're not the second guy or the third guy that said no to me. But how about being the first guy to step up and say yes? And that's how I did it. I actually kept appealing to that little voice inside themselves that said, you know something, if I just had the damn opportunity, I could show people that I really am the man. I'm the guy on top of the mountain. That's what I did each and every time. And I was lucky. I got 10, 8 in this tournament and 2 alternates for the first show. True story.
And you know, that's, I think, where there's a line of some connective tissue between you and Matt Serra. Matt Serra had one of the best quotes. You had a lot of great ones at the Hall of Fame induction speech. But the one I liked about Matt Serra said is, are you willing to go into harm's way to do the harm? And I think that when you were telling these guys, listen, I hear you. I hear that you're great, but are you willing to put it on the line?
Exactly.
To show me you're the greatest?
Exactly.
I agree you're great. Are you the greatest? Show me. Okay, so the UFC in the beginning was about matching up styles more than names. Was it always supposed to evolve into promoting names once those names were known? Or did you think people would be more interested in matching up the styles?
You know, early on, the idea was that this was truly a style versus style confrontation. You know, one of my working titles for the early event was War of the Worlds. And of course, we realized that was a complication with the famous science fiction book and movie. But we felt that it was an opportunity to showcase styles and to find out truly which one was the best. I thought, though, based on conversations I had with Horian and people that he had introduced me to in his world, that this would evolve. And in all truth, by the third UFC, fighters were starting to cross-train. I remember the Chemo Leopoldo showed up after UFC 3 at the Gracie Academy asking for jiu-jitsu lessons. The smart guys were starting to realize that they had deficiencies in what they thought was a complete fighting arsenal, and that they needed to be humble enough to say, you know, I better go back to the gym and get some training here in this, because I don't know how to handle that. So the fascination for me was to watch this evolution. I always say that the evolution of the rules happened because McCarthy and I were getting a lot of input from the politicians and the media. Gee, you better make this a little more sanctionable, you better make this a little more civilized. So the evolution of the rules went in that direction, but the evolution of the fighters happened. Fighting style evolution happened because the fighters evolved it. There was no directive, there was no memo from me saying, hey guys, what we need to do is to make a new sport out of this. The fighters themselves, by their very participation and immersion into this world, changed the universe. They took a lot of martial arts, mixed them up, and created something new called MMA.
It's a little bit in a way like capitalist combat. You got to figure, you know, the market sort of takes care of itself, right? So I'm going to go with some rapid fire questions. They may be a little all over the place, but these are the things. Again, I really want people to read your book. It's a fantastic book. I really want people to listen to your Hall of Fame speech. It was an amazing speech. Completely told the story from the beginning to the end. You knocked it out of the park. So I do have questions for you, but I want to steer away from that stuff so they go seek out those materials. So, in your opinion, is it more important who is in the cage or how they are filmed?
Well, you know, that's a tough and interesting question. I think really it's really who's in the cage. Ultimately, this is a star-driven sport, as boxing is. In fact, our sport, MMA, will really rise or fall with the appearance and the growth and the public's acceptance of stars. So to me, it's the guy in the cage.
If boxing and MMA, let me ask you this first. So you obviously have a boxing background. When you got into that wrestling situation and you saw boxing being exposed, did you sort of divorce yourself from it in a little bit? Meaning how sometimes boxing guys are like, they live and die with boxing. So when you went to create the UFC, did you really just have to dump all your biases and just say, yeah, I'm a boxer and I love boxing, but this is something else and I can't?
People have asked me about the evolution and the growth of the UFC and my role in it. I got to tell you, the biggest thing for me was to watch this natural process. And I, from the very beginning, that was a part of what was shaping what we were doing. But I got to tell you something. My greatest strength was the fact I didn't have a black belt in anything, so my biases were minimal. I had never become a great boxer. You can't look me up in some Hall of Fame there. So I think that the ability to go in, quite frankly, as a business guy, as a guy who knew how to sell, who knew how to communicate and market, was maybe my greatest strength. Also, we were in sports entertainment, and that there was an evolution to creating stars. And so for me, it wasn't a matter of finally saying, gee, boxing has kind of been shown to be a bit one-dimensional, and I kind of feel bad about that. My feeling was, what's happening is perfectly natural. The fans are digging it, and this thing has its own life and its own. It's moving forward.
If boxing and MMA were created on the same day, which would have been bigger?
MMA, absolutely. It's more complete, more primal, more real, more what it's supposed to be about. And I think that fans all over the world love a good fight, and that's why MMA continues to be the growth sport in the combat sports world.
Who's the toughest man you ever met?
Ooh, wow, I'd have to say Don Fry, the Predator. One of my great friends and one of the great acquisitions that I ever had in the world of booking fighters and getting him to the UFC. Don was one of those guys that he'd give you everything he had, and in fact, even to his detriment, he'd put it all on the line. For Don, it was all about, I'm here to give you everything I have to show you everything I am. And I don't think anybody laid it on harder or better than he did.
Absolutely. I mean, he was my guy. I told you that already. So that kind of transitions us a little bit into this next question. Who, in your opinion, and I think we could probably, I'd like to really get into this with you, who do you think was the first true mixed martial artist?
In some respects, I'd have to say Marco Ruas. Marco Ruas, we billed him as the king of the streets. The Gracies had either a love-hate relationship with him, either or. They kept telling me, well, compared to Rickson, Marco's not that big a deal. But the interesting thing about Marco was that he was the classic luta livre Brazilian stylist. He had the Muay Thai training. He had the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So he was the first guy, in my opinion, who stepped into the octagon and gave the fans the taste of where this was going. Now later there were a lot of other guys, including Frank Shamrock, in my humble opinion, that were an arrow pointing to the future. But in a way, that defeat of Paul Varlan's the polar bear with Muay Thai kicks to the quadricep was a wake-up call for a lot of martial artists. This is what you need to be able to defend against if you're going to compete in this arena.
I've long thought it was Frank Shamrock, and I completely understand the Marco Ruas comparison. The foot stomps really hadn't been seen before then, and he seemed like one of the more inventive guys. The fact we only saw him at UFC 7 was kind of like, a little bit unfortunate. But then when you talk about Frank, you have to talk about Ken, and I think Ken's been a little bit diminished by the losses to Hoyce, so it's a weird. But then, Don Fry. So. I'll have to send this link to you. I'm working on a project now called The Baddest Man on the Planet, where I start from the beginning and carry it all the way to today. And after we see who wins the fight tonight, that'll be the last guy in it. That'll be a little video package. I'll definitely send you that. But now let's talk about something you just brought up. How would the UFC have been different if Rickson would have fought in UFC 1 instead of Hoyce?
Rorion always felt so strongly, and not just based on the fact that he and Rickson maybe had bumped heads a few times on some personal issues, but he felt very strongly about the fact that Hoyce in the UFC the fans could connect with that, and he connected with me from a marketing standpoint. The little guy, the Bruce Lee size, a smaller man. Hoyce weighed 175 pounds soaking wet. Taylor Wiley in the first UFC weighed 420. Kevin Rozier weighed 310. So Rorion felt very strongly that if Rickson was in, Rickson was he was a jaguar in human form, 185 pounds, and as John McCarthy said, when he got he got you on the mat and you rolled with him, he felt like he weighed 700 pounds. So I think the question for many people, from fans who said to me, hey, if you had been able to get Rickson in, would that have been a different arc for the UFC? Would that have changed the sport or changed the public's perception of it? What do you think, Art Davie? I'd have to say something that that I think in some respects it might have even been benefited by having the smaller man, because now every week people would come and say to me, when are you going to do the next one? Can a little guy do that again? Hickson, quite frankly, he was one of the most impressive specimens I have ever known. I used to go to his exercise class a couple of times a week with a lot of the Torrance police force in Torrance, including, I remember, Captain Ray Augustine, Lieutenant Ray Augustine. After 20 or 30 minutes, I'd leave the class. One-legged squats, can't do them. Hickson would do 100 of them with either leg, and I would just shake my head and think to myself, he's not human.
Well, and it's a little bit, for fans of other sports, it's a little bit like comparing Steph Curry and Shaquille O'Neal. When I watch Shaquille, I'm never going to be Shaquille O'Neal, but I could be Steph Curry. And I think when people Hoist Gracie, they were like, maybe I could be Hoist. I'm never going to be Hickson. Maybe I could be Hoist. All right, which fighter in the history of UFC, from UFC 1 all the way today, do you think is the best representation of a mixed martial arts? When you look at them, you're like, that's the guy that I was thinking of. Who's the guy that best represents mixed martial arts?
That's a very good question. Who really, over the history of the UFC, 25 years, even the history of MMA, best represents the sport? The two guys come to mind immediately when I'm asked that question. I'd have to say George St. Pierre or Randy Couture. For some reason, both of those men had the combination of things that I think are important: courage, skill, tenacity, conditioning, a commitment to training. Also, I think the quality of having a certain amount of charisma without maybe that not being overly dominant, being accessible, being good with fans. Those two guys would be kind of at the top of my list if you asked me that question again. Absolutely.
And I think when you look at a guy like Randy, I think some of the losses, especially late in his career, take away from his legacy. But here's a guy who TKO'd Chuck Liddell, TKO'd Vitor Belfort. I mean, he went into their world and had success, beat Tim Sylvia. He started late, so already he's behind the curve. And I think that, I don't know, I agree with that. I think him and GSP both would be very good representations of what mixed martial arts was meant to be. Which of the fighters from your time would be successful today?
Well, that's a good question. I guess I could put at the top of the list would be the phenom, Vitor Belfort, because he's still fighting today, and he started so long ago. Vitor came to me young. I remember going up to Carlson Gracie's school on La Cienega, and he was training with Walid Ismail, and I was so impressed by him. He was being trained by Eddie Stanky. He could box, he could throw a straight punch, he could knock you out, and his jiu-jitsu skills were paramount too. Quite frankly, a lot of the fighters from that era wouldn't have made it today, and I think we all know that. A lot of the fighters from that era were one-dimensional, but a lot of guys were starting to show that ability to absorb the knowledge that they needed, to cross-train, and to get the understanding of what this sport was and was becoming. But you know something? When I think about that question, I realize how many of them really couldn't have done it. That's interesting. It goes to show you how far the sport has evolved.
I agree. I think, you talk about Don Fry, Mark Coleman, those guys probably, they were the beginning of the evolution. Don Fry had great hands and could also wrestle. I think that, so let's flip the question on its head. Which fighters from today do you think would have been successful in a no-holds-barred? Because even though they have very diverse skill sets, not everybody can go in there and eat soccer kicks or go in there with a sumo wrestler, open weight situations. Obviously, we know Shogun could because he's done it in other organizations. But who from today do you look at and go, man, if that guy was around in UFC 3 or 4, that would have been a hell of a guy?
I'll tell you something that John McCarthy and I have talked about and agree on. We think that if John Bones Jones was active back in the day, I think he would have been kicking ass back then too. He became, in many ways, the complete MMA fighter. Long-armed, lean, strong, with all the skills in the world. Very tough. I think he would have cleaned house back in the day, no doubt about it.
Who was the biggest name you ever tried to get in the UFC and never could land?
Alexander Karelyan, The Experiment. I remember talking about it to the Kowalski brothers, who had done not only amateur but professional wrestling and had a very close connection to him. And they told me, quite frankly, Art, you'd have a better chance of getting Mike Tyson out of jail in Indiana and getting him into the UFC than you would of getting a Karelyan. The Russians consider him a national resource, and you might try to get him, but you're not going to.
Is it because he was just putting too much on the line? His reputation, his concern with...
Well, also the issue that he was a national treasure to the Russian government, and they were not about willing to see that changed in any way, and they knew the value of him as a marketing icon. So I made an attempt, got nowhere. But early on, I was trying to get the Mark Gastineaus, the James Bonecrusher Smiths, the Leon Spinks, the Michael Spinks. I was always thinking outside the box, and I felt that was important because I was always putting myself in the fan's position. Who did the fan want to see me put in the octagon? That's how I ended up putting a sumo wrestler in 3 times. That's how I brought a professional boxer in. I wanted to see what the fan wanted to see. What really works, who's really tough, and who's going to be the king after all the dust and the smoke clears.
How did you feel after everything that you had gone through creating the UFC when you saw Ken Shamrock and Royce Gracie both in their 50s fighting Bellator? What did you think about that fight? How did it make you feel?
People have asked me about, some sort of a senior league, a Legends tour. Quite frankly, I'm not a big enthusiast for it. I can see why some fans would want to see how about a third or fourth matchup between A and B, Tito and Chuck. But on the other hand, when you see somebody in their prime, to watch someone come back and try to put the lightning back in the bottle at age 50, it's hard. And I think maybe on some level it can be a little depressing and make all of us feel we're getting a little older.
You put super fights on in your day, played a big role in that phrase, becoming part of the MMA culture, the culture at large. What do you think about the one we have this weekend, Stipe versus Daniel Cormier?
This one is really exciting, and I think that's why it's going to be, by every measurement standard, the biggest show of the year. You got the light heavyweight champ and the heavyweight champ. This is, I think, one of the great classic matchups. I think they'll be talking about this one, and I got my fingers crossed that it's going to be a barn burner tonight. But I think they'll be talking about this one 10 years from today, really.
What's the most amazing moment you ever witnessed in a cage?
I have to say it was UFC 2, a 16-man tournament. Royce Gracie had to compete against beat 4 men that night to win $60,000. When I look back on that, I realized that was an epic situation, an epic moment in time, one which will never come back again.
Let's do some quick word association, and I'm going to steal a question from another interview show, and I'll get you out of here. Sean Wheelock, when you hear that name.
Sean Wheelock, consummate play-by-play guy, both not only for MMA but for boxing, and I'll be honest with you, one of my best friends at this point. A guy who I think really has my back in every way, shape, and form.
Dana White.
Dana White, the face of the UFC. A tremendous showman, and a guy that the fans either going to love him or hate him at any given moment. I think he's been a tremendous plus to the UFC. The UFC needed someone to do what Vince McMahon did for professional wrestling, and I think we got him in Dana White. He stands very tall above the mountain.
Quick follow-up question before I go to the next person. Do you think that Dana, being the celebrity that he is, allows the UFC a little bit of wiggle room when their stars aren't there? That he remains a star in his own right?
Absolutely. I think one of the big pluses that Dana brings to the party is that Dana's a star. He's got the charisma, he's got the personality, he's got the belief in himself that he is the man in that respect. And I think in any given situation in the UFC as it grows and does, and they have an off show, an off month, Dana's there to provide some continuity for the fans and some attention. And I got to tell you something, you can't undervalue that. You eventually have to realize you're in show business entertainment. That's the name of the game.
Lorenzo and Frank Fertitta.
The two guys who saved the UFC with smarts, money, and balls. They brought it back bigger and better. And, I like to tell people that I would never have been in the Hall of Fame last night if they hadn't done what they did. These are guys who had the courage to be as much as $50 million in the hole and still move forward, champions themselves. In business, those guys are the ultimate fighting champions.
Bob Meyerowitz.
Meyerowitz was always in a little bit over his head. This was a guy who really didn't come from the martial arts or the fighting world in any way, shape, or form. He was a consummate professional in pay-per-view, consummate professional in the entertainment business, both in radio and cable TV. And, my sympathy goes to Bob because it got tougher and tougher as we got close to UFC 15, UFC Japan, where there was so much pressure on him. And he was realizing, all I'm getting is kicked, and all I'm getting is being asked why I'm a bad guy. He was really a guy who I think found himself in a situation where he probably had to say to himself, how did this happen to me?
Campbell McLaren.
Campbell's a great guy, funny guy, a guy who championed me to his boss. Another guy, though, who doesn't know a wrist lock from a wristwatch. And in all fairness, he's always been a guy who I think has a hard time really understanding what goes on inside a cage or a ring.
John McCarthy.
McCarthy, for me, was the spiritual center of our world. He was the guy who understood more than a lot of us did where this thing was going. It had to evolve from a spectacle to a sport. He created the standards for fighter safety. He created the template to be a referee. And he was my best friend in so many respects. He was the only guy who could tell me to shut up. Tell me, Art, you're wrong. And he was the only guy I would listen to when it came to what was going on inside the cage. If there was anybody I really wanted to know an answer to a question, the guy I would go to first was John McCarthy.
I think something that gets lost in the shuffle, because like I said, I've been watching, I'm not a young man. I've been watching the fights for a long time. McCarthy was a star in his own right. When you watched the UFC and he said, are you ready, let's get it on, you never got more excited than when that happened. And he was in the cage for each fight. So if there was a fight between a couple of guys you weren't sure about yet or maybe didn't have interest in, McCarthy said, let's do it. The fighters knew, the fans knew, it's time to work.
Right.
The UFC.
I remember David Meyerowitz, Bob Meyerowitz's brother, who was Bob's attorney. He once turned to me at one of the shows and he said, Art, I don't know where you got McCarthy from, but he's the star. I said, you think so? He said, I'm telling you. He said, McCarthy, you can't invent a guy like John McCarthy. The funny story is that John, after UFC 1, got a fighter application from Kathy Kidd, my COO, my operations officer, and he filled it out. He didn't bring it to me. He went over to the academy with it, and I get a call from Horian saying, John's over here with an application to fight. He said, do you want to come over and you and I will explain to him that he can't be on two sides of the street, he can't be with the Gracies, and he can't be in this event and fight a Gracie. So John early on thought about fighting. And I always ask him, in fact, I was at his house the other night. I said, Don, do you ever have any regrets? He said, no. He said, I did the right thing by becoming a referee. I was in the right place at the right time. Two reasons why John was the consummate referee. Number one, nobody in that cage could give John any lip. John was the man. Every fighter knew it. No fighter wanted to ever get into a mix-up with John. John was the guy who could kick your ass if he had to. Second thing was, you saw in John's body language and in his words and in his eyes, fighter safety was important. Every fighter that ever fought for him that I would talk to after would tell me, we knew John had our back. We knew that John was looking to make sure that I wasn't going to get hurt. He said that was actually a good feeling to have, knowing that John was there to protect me. I don't know how many fighters said that to me.
Well, there's something about knowing that as dangerous as the sport is, this guy's not going to let it get out of control. He can handle it. He can be the guy that can stop whatever might happen. All right, last two. The UFC. When you hear that, what do you think?
The premier brand, the Coca-Cola of combat sports. In some respects, I think this is the harbinger of what's going to be the biggest sport in the world. You have to remember, it was the biggest sport for over 1,000 years in the ancient Greek Olympics. So I think that the UFC will continue to be the premier brand, the one that everybody looks towards. That's never going to stop. I would be shocked to ever see a change in that. I'll be gone in maybe 10 years, but I got to tell you something. 30 years from now, the UFC will continue to be the sport on the planet, in my humble opinion.
And the interesting thing is, as your career and your life sort of evolves, you've gone from the UFC being your child in many ways to your grandchild, meaning that you don't always see eye to eye with the parents, but there's still that love there. Maybe you have a fondness for you have a different relationship, a more playful relationship. The UFC Hall of Fame.
I got to tell you, the UFC Hall of Fame was a great honor and a thrill for me, and I'll tell you why. There are a lot of people have read my book, Is This Legal? And they know my story. And I always say that maybe there's 5,000 people on the planet who probably know who Art Davie is. When the UFC extends the opportunity to enter the Hall of Fame, I realize that there's going to be a lot more people now that will know who I am. Because the UFC is, again, the premier brand, and the Hall of Fame is the greatest award and tribute in the sport. And I think on that basis alone, I'm really excited that I was inducted 2 nights ago.
And lastly, I've always wanted to steal this question. You're a great guy to ask it to. Art, if heaven exists, what do you want said to you when you arrive at the pearly gates?
You did your job as the midwife. You got the baby born. God bless you. Come in.
You sure did. Art, it's been a true pleasure to interview you. All of this weekend would not be possible if not for your efforts, if not for your perseverance throughout this. And again, congratulations on the Hall of Fame. It's long overdue, but it was at the right time.
Thank you, John.
Absolutely.
Good stuff.